Okay, this is the guidepost for uh, this coming Thursday evening, which is what is this? The 22nd, 23rd? I don't know, whatever Thursday is. All right, so we've been talking about a number of things, including how do we relate to the nature of God? How do we deal with understanding the nature of mind? So I'm going to try to piece it together a couple of things today, and this is going to be quite complex. We did last week start to pull together uh, references to the eight orders of being, and so I'm going to try and kind of show how all of these fit together for me. Okay, so let's start with mind. Mind is an emergent property that we all experience. We know our own mind to some degree, right? And mind is constructed out of, as with all things emergent, three different qualities of mind, of brain. The brain's capacity to, first of all, be intelligent. And intelligence has to do with the capacity that I have to make what's going on out there present for me as some kind of mental object. I'm going to make sense of things. It's sort of a one-to-one correlation between that thing that's happening and what's happening in me. The second thing is that we gather information. I gather data. There's all these things that I see going on, and I'm pulling together all of what is arising, and I store it in my memory so I can recover it. And so all of this has to do with knowledge. Can I get these data bits? Do I remember when the Battle of Hastings was, or whatever it is that I'm being able to piece all of this together? So I have intelligence, I have knowledge, but I also have wisdom. Wisdom is the capacity to see patterns. Oh, this has happened before, and this is going to happen again, and this is when it happens. And so by being able to do pattern recognition, we are capable of making meaning. And so between the wisdom of seeing the patterns, the knowledge of all these data bits, and the intelligence of being able to process this information, we get this quality of consciousness that we refer to as our mind. Right? So as we're growing in each of these things towards a fuller experience of mind, our minds grow, they expand. We discern with greater and greater depth and detail. And it appears to us that our reality, our experience, creates consciousness. But the best of the new science tells us that the opposite is true. As a matter of fact, it is consciousness that creates reality. Now, this is not quite the same thing as saying that our mind creates matter, but it's very close corollary to the assertion, for example, at the beginning of the book of John, the Gospel of John, where John says, in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word there is the logos, which means kind of the template for all that it is to come. We can think of it, and so then it comes into being. That from this primordial mind comes the birthing of creation, of reality. And this is really a very common theme in creation stories about how it is that things came to be out of some primordial ooze. One of the indigenous stories from North America is of the creation of Turtle Island, is that these various beings, prototypical beings, dived down into the muck of the ooze and pulled up dirt and put it on the back of the turtle. And so all of this stuff on the back of the turtle becomes the place in which we live, or Turtle Island. All right. So let's review what we've all experienced by way of experience. What is experience revealed to us as we grow in consciousness? So we've pieced together this consciousness because as we began to make sense of the world back in our infancy, we discovered that we were not the other. One of the first really important distinctions that we make is the difference between me and not me. There's a difference between my teething ring and my thumb. And so this distinction between me and not me is the birth of what we call the separate self sense. I have to know that I am not you. I am not the world around me. I am, and this capacity to know the difference between what is arising and what is aroused in me becomes a very important part of how we are able to function in the world, right? If we are too fully identified with everything that is arising, that is going on, we become overwhelmed. We can't cope, right? We can't differentiate between those things that demand our attention and those that aren't less relevant. And so we, because we're overwhelmed, we just sort of tune out. We spend the first several years of our lives learning to relate to the material world in which we find ourselves. We learn to cross the street looking both ways. We learn how to tie our shoes, to button our shirt. We know how to get by physically. We know how to deal with abstract constructs. We learn how to read and how to write. We learn how to have polite conversations. We know how to mind our manners, and we know how to mind our parents. We have a mind which is above us, manners and parents, which we mind in order to be able to get along well in the world. Now, there's another line of development. That line of development of just being able to mind. Usually we're pretty good at that by the time we're 10 or so, right? But there's another kind of developmental line that begins even while we're playing in the sandbox or playing house or whatever it is we're doing as little kids, is that we're playing with others. And this starts out as a kind of parallel play where we're playing the same thing, but little by little we begin to play together. So we're building the same thing in the sandbox. We're building the same fantasy with our action figures or our dolls. And so we begin to create mutual relationships in which we are co-creating something. And this capacity continues to grow throughout our lives. But in early adolescence, this capacity to be in mutual relationships with peers, not with our parents, not with people who were not with people we have to mind, but with each other in a mutual relationship. This becomes more and more important. And at first we begin to do this kind of in fantasy. Oh, what would it be like to be with? And we to see what we desire. Oh, isn't he dreamy? You know, or isn't she hot? Or whatever. We have a sort of fantasy of being in a significant relationship. But at some point we decide, okay, I'm going to have to go ahead and ask her out on a date or begin to connect with someone in a deeper way. Right? So it goes from being just in general kind of connecting to being a specific person that we connect with. And we begin to try to do that. And inevitably, we're new at this. You know, this is really hard to do. And so inevitably, we fail at it. And because this was so important to us, we feel horrible. And we have all these feelings coming up that we've never felt before. And we begin to have to pay attention to our own interiority at that point so that we can figure out what's happening, what's going on with me. How can I make sense of this? Right? So we're confused. We're trying to make sense of what's happening to us. But it leads us into a deeper level of self-awareness. And as we become more deeply aware of ourselves, so now I'm reflecting on myself, there's a kind of resilience that happens for us as we are able to self-reflect. Right? And as we do that, the need to keep this separate self-sense begins to relax. I don't have to see myself as separate from others as much. I'm okay. You know, I got me. And I can be present to others in a deeper way. We can begin to identify more and more with others. We experience unity in the community. So this is a developmental line that all of us have traced more or less. Some of us less because we've grown up into chaotic or abusive households, and to the degree to which we've lived in that chaos, we've experienced a trauma or traumas that have impaired our capacity to build these mutual relationships and the capacity to develop a really solid sense of self. So it's harder for some people than it is for others, given their surroundings, but it's possible for anybody. We all have this potential. So as we're talking about this process we're moving through, I'm talking about this is just one developmental line in terms of how we construct relationships with others and how that's related to how we see ourselves. This developmental line is one of literally hundreds of developmental lines that we can trace, but they all move through essentially the same phases, stages, layers, levels, realms, whatever we call these things. And it is an infinite gradient, but we can't really talk about things without kind of focusing on something. So for our purposes, I find it helpful to just think about this in terms of the four realms, which are the material personal realm, the relational interpersonal realm, the interior inner intrapersonal realm, and the spiritual or transpersonal realm, these four realms. The material, the relational, the interior, internal, or spiritual realms, right? So the nature of being is all of these realms, all of these layers, all of these stages, however we deem these. The reality, being, is all of these everywhere, all the time. That's the nature of being. Everything, always, everywhere, right? But we're finite. So we can't get our heads around everything all at once, everywhere. So we have to break it down. We have to make it simpler. And we can see with greater depth when we focus on one thing at a time, right? So it is in the mystery of the nature of being that we choose to focus our attention on and observe something. And by that something that we are observing, the thing that we, by that observation, we create the thing that we're observing. Huh? Wait a minute, let me say that again. I'm going to read it to you. So it's in the mystery of the nature of being that when we choose to focus our attention and to observe something, we are by that act creating the thing that we are observing. Whoa, that's just too big. We can't get our heads around that, right? So we want to make it simple enough that we can understand it and that we can remember that it's actually, and we want to remember that it's actually far more complex than the cognitive map that we're using. The maps that we make to make meaning are necessarily simpler than reality. That's their purpose. We can't take in all of it, so we're going to make it simpler so that we can understand it. We're going to be able to make meaning. And we are seeing from our own perspective, which means that how I see it and how you see it are likely to be different. And that what I'm seeing is actually different because what I'm seeing as you is outside of the me. So there's this distinction that we make between the me and the not me. And we observe that what's arising is something over which I have no control. The only control I have is over the me. And sometimes I don't even control that, right? And so we observe that we have a choice in how it is that we're going to respond to the arising. So there's what's arising and there's what it arouses in me. So we have these four realms, dimensions, stages, whatever we call them. And in each stage, we have the arising and the arousing. That means within these four levels, there are two sides of it. So that leaves us with 8 layers or orders of being, right? So this is true for everything, everywhere, all the time. But being, again, is too big to get our heads around. And the thing of which we are most familiar is ourselves. So I know me better than I know anything else. I know the not me as a general thing, but I know the me as a specific thing. And so the way that we normally talk about these 8 orders of being is by looking at the 8 orders of self, because it is a specific example of the larger whole. But we want to be able to remember that this isn't just me, it just isn't you, it just isn't humans. It's all of being at all the levels, all the time, everywhere. Okay, so if you are not familiar with the 8 orders of self, or these orders of being, you may want to pause here and check out another video that I'm going to make available to you, which kind of explains more of that. Some of you are very much familiar with that, so we can just move on here. So we started with the observation that mind is an emergent property that will naturally and dependably arise when we have intelligence, we have knowledge, and we have wisdom. That is, when we can mentally represent what's happening out there in the reality around us, when we can gather that data and remember it, and when we can discern and make meaning of the patterns by wisdom, right? We create mind, and thus our awareness of reality. Now, our capacity to do this develops as we grow, so we grow in wisdom. We're able to see more and more, using more and more complex cognitive maps to see with greater and greater depth. Our capacity for apprehending reality, for understanding what's going on, grows. Our consciousness expands. And all of this will happen naturally throughout our lives because we just have to pay attention to what's going on. And so we will naturally grow, right? Some of us get farther than others by the time of our death, but we do what we can. But why? What's the purpose of all of this, right? Why would we want to do this? Well, when we expand our consciousness, we better comprehend the nature of reality. And because consciousness creates reality, we are expanding consciousness. We're expanding reality. And when we do that, we become better able to make the best possible choice, which creates more and more of what we need. And the more I'm creating what it is that I need, I'm creating more of what those around me need. And so we become part of this larger evolution of consciousness. We are the stuff by which the universe is becoming able to reflect on itself. Right? Wow, that's a pretty big task. You want to do this. If you want to do this, it's really great because it's a lot of work, but there's a joy that comes from it. There's a kind of peace and solidity of knowing that what I'm doing in my life really matters. So is there anything we can do to help this process along? Is there something that I can do which helps me to expand my consciousness? And of course, the answer is yes. There's all kinds of things we can do. There are lots of different spiritual practices that we can engage in. Meditation, prayer, journaling, yoga, walking the Camino. There's all kinds of things that we can do that will expand our consciousness and thus make us better at being able to make the decisions that create what we and those around us need, right? So as we do that, our work is the integration of mind and matter. We, as material beings, are opening our minds to that which is above us, and we're being mindful of higher mind, and we're consciously opening ourselves up to the guidance of the universe. And as we do that, we grow up into fuller ways of being, and we integrate the material world and the spiritual world, and we bring the spirit into the material, right? So this whole process of being able to integrate spirit and matter, to be able to bring the material world up into this, and the mind reaches down to matter and matter up to mind. This integration, this pulling together of spirit and matter is exactly what Father Richard Rohr talks about in sort of his magnum opus, which is his book called The Universal Christ. You don't have to be a Christian to understand universal, but it's this capacity to be integrated materially and spiritually, which is on all of our paths. We're going to do it little by little. We can do it intentionally. And that's what we're trying to do here as we join together on the pilgrimage, right? I'll see you Thursday.